Welcome to the Social Change Diaries, the show that looks behind the curtain at everything you want to know about the social justice and nonprofit landscape. I'm your host, Vanessa Wakeman. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of the Social Change Diaries. Today's guest, Jacki Zehner, has been recognized as one of the top 50 most powerful women in U.S. philanthropy. I've watched Jacki use her voice to advocate for women and girls, and she's a constant source of inspiration for me. Jacki dedicates her time and resources toward the advancement of women and girls. She's the founding president of Women Moving Millions, a community of over 300 members who have collectively given over $1 billion to organizations and programs that focus on females, making Women Moving Millions the largest philanthropic network in the world of women funding women. That's amazing. Prior to her philanthropic focus, Jacki was a partner and managing director at Goldman Sachs, where she was the youngest woman and the first female trader to make partner. As the president of the Jacqueline and Gregory Zehner Foundation, Jacki funds and champions a wide variety of projects and organizations with a particular focus on women's rights, women's entrepreneurship, philanthropic movement building, and social issue media. In addition to her work with Women Moving Millions, Jacki serves on a number of boards and advisory committees and is an active writer, speaker, and consultant on topics relating to women and wealth, philanthropy, and leadership. She has been recognized for her leadership with many awards, including being named to the 2015 and 2016 Economist Global Diversity List as a top 50 diversity figure in public life and being profiled for makers. So, folks, we are nearing the end of our first season of the Social Change Diaries, and I'm super excited to have today's guest with me, Jacki Zehner from Women Moving Millions, who's going to talk about women in thought leadership and some of her journey. So, Jacki, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me and ending the season or being close to it. That's exciting.
It really is. It really is. So, Jacki, tell us a little bit about the work that you do at Women Moving Millions.
Well, thank you. Women Moving Millions, it's got such a big name, right? It's like, what is women and then moving and then millions? We could unpack all three of those for about an hour. But we have this crazy and audacious mission, which is to mobilize unprecedented resources for the advancement of women and girls. So that's our mission statement, and how it's activated, or sort of how it lands sort of in a primary way, is it's a community of women and men that have individually given or committed to give $1 million or more to nonprofit organizations that prioritize women and girls in their funding. So we started many, many years ago. Actually, we just celebrated the 10th anniversary since the beginning of the campaign to encourage women to do that. And we're closing in on 300 members in 14 countries with giving well exceeding $1 billion.
Wow. That's giving. That's awesome. Congratulations on that. Jacki, of that group and of that, big pie of money, pool of money, how much of the resources of the organization are targeted to supporting to get women to lead more? So there's been a lot of conversation, particularly in our current political climate, about us needing more, women leaders in the political environment, in the corporate environments, even in the nonprofit environments. Is there any sort of targets of the organization around how we can prepare more women to lead?
Well, yes, but it's so multifaceted, the answer. This money that is pledged or given does not in and of itself go to Women Moving Millions to be redistributed in any way. So it's up to each individual member where she or he puts those dollars. It could be around women's health, around economic empowerment and violence against women. But the thread, and we hope the lens that's applied, is that embedded in all of that is a desire to support women's, not only as recipients of resources, whether it be programmatically or financially, but women's leadership and inclusion all the way through. I can speak for myself and, of course, have gotten to know countless women that are part of our community. But it's the idea that you put a gender lens to all of it. So most of the organizations, by definition, if they're women-focused, often are led by women. So that's one layer of support of women's leadership. Obviously, we're supporting the leaders that are giving the money, the philanthropic leadership, and we could talk more about a major initiative we have coming down the pike with respect to women's philanthropic leadership. But it's also ensuring, we hope, I think, a sophisticated approach to how you do choose organization and distribute those funds, that those that are the recipients of the program are actively involved in creating the programs that are meant to help them. So I think the model is one of very holistic approach to women's leadership. And of course, some of the organizations may be focused on political parity or women's leadership in the business field more directly. But I would say supporting women leaders surrounds everything we do.
Yes, yes, yes. Now, let's talk about you for a moment. So your personal philanthropy has been focused quite a bit on women and girls. Did you have a specific aha moment? So I had an interesting conversation with a woman recently who was sharing that she's somewhat careful about how she is approaching her philanthropy as her family because she has 4 sons and didn't want to lean too far towards, women-led initiatives. And I just thought that was a really interesting approach, a way to think about it when we know that there are these sort of inequalities. Like, I would want to make my family and my children more aware. So curious to see if there was a specific moment for you when you felt like this was something that you wanted to champion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never thought about it as kind of a moment until recently when I shared my Me Too story on LinkedIn literally just about a month ago. My professional background, which is really enabling my philanthropic work now, was that I had a career at Goldman Sachs. I was a partner and managing director as a trader, and when I was one of the very few women on the trading floor back in the 1990s, late 80s. And, there weren't that many women. And again, this is a very long time ago. I would kind of always have this question of like, where are the women and why aren't they in finance? And such an amazing career path. And I personally experienced pretty horrendous experience around sexual harassment that almost ended my career. And it didn't. Obviously, I stayed there, and that's a much longer story. But, as I sat with this movement that's building around sexual harassment, I wondered to myself if I would be the activist I am today and the funder I am today and take it on as really my life's purpose had I not had that personal experience, which up to that time was a pretty charmed life. So yes, I do trace that aha moment, especially in hindsight, back to really personally realizing that my future was not in my hands, but in the hands of someone who was treating me differently because I was female and in a highly inappropriate, way, and that my destiny was not mine. And the reason it wasn't mine in this particular situation was because of being female. So that really ignited over time, my leadership at Goldman Sachs, especially women in the corporate sector and in finance. And then when I retired from Goldman, really this work became my full-time job.
Got it. And thank you for sharing your story. So the Me Too movement has been, there's been so much courage and vulnerability displayed within that. It's really moving and sort of transformative. When we think about women raising their voices, there's often this fear that we're not going to be taken seriously. We're not going to be believed. We're not going to have the support that men have, not even on issues, such as personal as this, but just around social issues, that are impacting the world. What do you think and I know this is sort of like a broad strokes question, but what do you think is needed for more women to use their voices to tackle some of the issues that we're facing now?
Yeah, I think it's community. I feel like my whole world is sort of circling around sort of this core concept of what it means to be in community with one another. And I think that's really it. And by community, I mean surrounded and part of something bigger than yourself, sharing values with people for which you have responsibility and they have responsibility back to you to support each other in what's right. And, for me, I mean, there's so many examples of this even in the past week that I could say, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the narrative we need to grab hold of and sort of release what's dominant in our culture, which is this idea of rugged individualism, and it's all about self, to one of, no, we are in this together, hopefully anchored around sort of basic human rights framework. And I think that's it. I mean, because I think it is a fearful thing. I think when you do put yourself out there, you are vulnerable. I mean, so many of the leaders I think you've interviewed and talked to say what happens to them when they're in the forefront of issues that are anchored in a sense of what's right and what's true, and yet the backlash around that can be incredible. So if we do not support each other and protect each other and inspire one another and, more even concretely resource one another, then change won't happen. It's always been true, that change, in some ways anchored in truth is in some ways inevitable, but we may not see it in the mess of building that critical mass. So I think it's community, and it's what I crave, it's what I believe in, and in some ways, as I look back too, it's what I have been spending the past 20 years of my life trying to do for women.
Yeah. And I think that's somewhat the difference in the journey between men and women. And so in the hero's journey, there's this sort of lone, cowboy, doing the work and, changing the world or sort of saving the person. And I think in the heroine's journey, there is a need for community and collaboration and sisterhood in a way to sort of nurture one another. So I definitely think that's important. Our initiative, She Roars, is focused on helping women in the nonprofit sector to become thought leaders. And one of the things that I hear most frequently, which is so painful to me, is that women don't feel like they have any value to what they have to say, that they don't think that they'll be taken seriously, or that they're afraid to sort of be on the unpopular side of like what the common thinking is on something. As far as your thought leadership, are there any particular challenges that you've faced in your role in trying to elevate, the place of women and girls in the world and leading an organization like this where we are taking, resources from women to support other women? What has your journey been like?
It's been an interesting one. And I would say even now, just starting to be really about intention and realizing the power that I do have, despite, I think, being sort of a person in the world saying, women know your power. I'm not sure I've ever even known my power or fully tapped into it. I think the journey to be, and I love how you talk about a thought leader as being in service of an idea, an issue, or an innovation to foster change. I'm only beginning to even say, oh my gosh, yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing and what I've been trying to do for 10 years. So I think early days it was, and I think that the network, that the world that can support you technology and platform-wise now versus 10 years ago is completely different in terms of how quickly you can emerge as a thought leader and get momentum, because of social media, et cetera. But in my early blogging days, which is now like eight years ago, I guess, I was just I said, I have these ideas and these people I want to amplify, and these, whether it be gender impact investing or an organization, a women's foundation, a piece of research, let me just start blogging about it and sharing it because I used to do that by email or phone call or whatever. So when I started to do that 9 years ago, there's still a lot of backlash today, only now I can block them and say, sorry, you're not seeing my content anymore. But there was a lot of threats. I mean, I think it's a common theme with a lot of people that you've interviewed is, there's a lot of anger and pushback against change and a lot of fear. And there's this quote I just heard, for those that are accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And that was like, whoa, that is so true. So I think that I still am scared sometimes to put certain ideas out there in fear of what might come back. And I think having community and women behind me and learning over time to not let a minority voice be the voice that stays with me or is whispers in my ear, don't take those chances, is the one I'm trying to push out. But yeah, I think it's changed a lot. I think now is really about not coming from that place of I can't, I shouldn't, I won't, to I will, and I can, and I know, and I believe. My favorite quote from the Wonder Woman movie, which I could talk about forever, it is inevitably about what do you believe, and if you're anchored in energy and passion and expertise and self-awareness, step out and know and seek those that will have your back and you will have theirs.
Yes, perfectly stated, perfectly stated. One of the things that we saw after this presidential election last year, we heard a lot of people talking. There were a lot of conversations about feminism and intersectionality. Would you classify the work of Women Moving Millions as intersectional? And how are you able to ensure that the most marginalized people, within the groups that you're helping are being hurt? And so I know you're not directly giving out the money, but do you have any insight or any sort of say in any of that to make sure that the people who are most oppressed are heard and have the ability to sort of share how they think that change can be brought about?
Yeah, I think Women Moving Millions tries to do that at a number of levels. One is what we curate for our members, who we bring to speak at our events, what research we're encouraging people to process and listen to, how so much of that curation is meant to be with an intersectional lens. And I think we've had awareness around it for a while and have really been intentional in trying to be a leader in this conversation as it relates to philanthropic movement building. So I'm proud of our work. I always think we have more work to do, but that is certainly something we're very, very, very mindful of, and making sure that, the voices we are lifting up, sort of voices that might not be in sort of mainstream perspectives, et cetera. I think it's also obviously at an individual level with our members. It's their journey to be on, but I do think a lot of our members are truly just leaders in this space, like the Embry Family Foundation with Lauren and Gail Embry as members, and others that are, that truly get it. And that's the power of the community, is that we educate one another and we lift up sort of those issues that are really, really, really important. I think we're just at sort of the beginnings of these conversations, especially intersectionality as it relates to how funding is done and, communities of privilege and all of that. So I think we take it super seriously and are really in this journey together.
I guess as a side point to that, in some of that intersectionality, like what advice would you give to a woman that would one day want to lead a nonprofit? And so we've seen some reports that came out earlier this year that said that women of color are still at the bottom of the list as far as leadership opportunities. People of color in general, are at the bottom of list as far as leadership opportunities in the nonprofit sector. And then women also lag behind men leading nonprofits. Like, do you have any advice that you would give to someone that's in the space that wants to take a leadership role?
Yeah, of course. I think it's helping, again, to educate others on your unique experiences in the world and what can be sort of done, what can be institutionalized to help and support not only you, but, others. I do think there's great intention around creating more inclusive workplaces, and one where meritocracy is not a myth, but a reality. But yet there's a lot of things that have to be done to make it so. And there's a lot of rhetoric around the desire to create inclusive workplaces that really do support sort of talent development and recognize that people have very unique experiences and how to value those with the reality of making it so. So I used to do some work in sort of corporate diversity space at Goldman and other places. And I do think the practice has to evolve to really think of what's working and what's needed. And there are no better people to, inspire and decide what can be done than those that are experiencing it. It's somewhat ironic that philanthropy in many ways has evolved, I hope, to say, listen to the people you're trying to help and serve and help them, design the programs and initiatives that will create change. And yet in the corporate environment, we seem to still think that people at the top who by definition oftentimes are, have experienced the most privilege and the most unlikely to know what it's like to be not of the majority in an organization, are tasked with coming up with the strategies without even asking. So it's sort of this idea of the human design process to diversity and inclusion really being embedded in the nonprofit, the corporate, and everything that we do. So, my advice to those folks that are working at that careers and findings of their workplaces are not valuing them is helping to create, the strategies and the initiatives that will work for them, and being, vocal in their approach, and not being passive. I mean, that's asking a lot of the people, because of course I think the accountability is absolutely with management to build a culture of inclusivity and respect, of course. So I don't mean to do the whole just lean in and everything will be okay, because that's not my message, but it's a both and.
Got you. So one of the things that I talk to clients about, and some of them love the idea and others, do not like it at all, is nonprofits, ideally to me, should be working towards putting themselves out of business. We should be in the business of solving problems. So what would need to happen for Women Moving Millions to no longer have a need to exist?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's sort of the, evolution of what our core purpose was, which is to put a gender lens for philanthropy. When we started, and it's still very much true today, such a small percentage of philanthropic funding went specifically to programs that support females. And it's not necessarily to say that it all went to men, but it was not employed in such a way that took into account the unique experiences of people, not just the binary male-female, but across the gender spectrum. So a lot of our work, and where I'm super proud over the years, and this isn't just me, of course, in Women Moving Millions, it's been the work of the women's funding movement, is to say, who are we serving? Women and girls are half the population, and what are their unique life experiences, unique needs that command, at least half of the philanthropic funding. And again, not in that strictly binary term, that meaning if we get to half, the work will be done, but it's really about making philanthropic capital more impactful, because it's smarter, it's listening to the constituents and what's in those in which it's serving, and there's more balance, and ultimately the goal is to create positive change and a more gender balanced and inclusive world, not just for equality's sake, but just to improve the lives of everyone. And a lot of the work of the women's funding movement has been as well to make the case that when you support women as head of households and as family leaders and give them economic power and access to basic human rights, they make very wise decisions for their family, their communities, and so the world. So I think this movement to say fund women and girls is really a bigger, more complicated message and purpose, which is to have greater accountability of philanthropic capital to serve the needs of the people that it's, we're given the mission by nature of a philanthropic status to serve. So, I don't think we'll ever be out of business in the sense that, assuming we always need community. And at the heart of Women Moving Millions, despite our mission, is really a community of change makers that want to do everything they can, including activating their own leadership for the betterment of humanity. So I don't think we'll ever be out of business. I think the business will change, our focus will change. But if we get to a more gender balanced world, anything approaching equality in my lifetime, I will say job well done.
I agree. I'll be right there with you with the high five.
Thank you.
So I would imagine, Jackie, that in your work you meet, women from all over the world, different walks of life. I feel like we all need the same things. Like there's some commonality. Like, have you seen, or are there any sort of common threads that you see with women around the world as far as like what they want from the world?
Yeah, but I don't think it's even different from what men want, frankly. I mean, people want to have, a life where they can thrive. And, there's a great term, I would just stretch for it, and then I found it, that Molly Melching, one of my favorite organizations, is Toast On, And actually, just this past week in New York, we celebrated Molly moving from founder to a co-leader of this organization that works in 4 countries in West Africa, a very community-based model that's been given huge credit for helping to end female genital cutting and child marriage, across Senegal, but many other countries. And she had this term that I was like, oh my gosh, I love this. It's called capacity to aspire. And it was such a beautiful frame to say, in so many places, you're just so busy protecting self against violence or having enough to eat or safe water that there's no, the idea that you could reach your potential or that you could live the dream of, growing up somewhere and ending up, somewhere else where your life position for you and your family is substantially enhanced and changed, just can't happen. So if we all might as a world be at such a place where everyone is sort of that place of feeling that they do have that, their core needs so taken care of that they can have or do have the capacity to aspire, to me that sort of encompasses this collective goal that I think we would have for not only, females, women, children, but men and boys as well.
Jackie, I feel like you have such a strong vision, and you've done tremendous work since sort of taking the helm of the organization. What would you like to see by 2020? And I know that's not a long time, but 2 years, a little over 2 years out, as we're going into our next presidential election, what would you like to see as far as progress related to women and girls?
Yeah, it's funny you mention that because I just had a major conference here in Utah, and Rosie Rios, the former treasurer of the United States, was here speaking, and she has this major initiative called Empowerment 2020, which was sort of asking the same question and a work back, obviously, to the anniversary of women's right to vote, and with this idea of, what's possible over that time frame. And I'm actually about to set myself on the journey of exactly that question for myself, but also in the context of perhaps organizations that I'm attached to and trying to get sort of a collective sort of envisioning, then backward look, and maybe help inspiring that or supporting that amongst nonprofits that I'm affiliated with. So I think that's a fantastic question that I do not have the answer to. But I will tell you what I'm feeling right now, and I have to confess to being just a little more than fired up about it, is that I feel like so much of the work of feminism and the women's movement has been, appropriately so in many ways, reacting to sort of the forces or this sort of patriarchal structure that, of course, exists and has dominated for the entire of human history. So part of where my head is going, which is really shifting my energy away from this idea of incremental change into really leapfrogging into a completely different place, is that change of mindset, which to say, let's imagine the world not as it is, but what is possible under a set of assumptions where women are in their power. We make 80 to 85% of consumer purchasing decisions. We're half the U.S. workforce. And we have control over, a lion's share of the investment assets, that are out there. And coming from a place of knowing our power and stepping into our power, and by power, I don't mean the power over, but power to, and seeing ourselves as part of this global community of women that are saying, enough is enough with systems and structures, whether it be, we talk about sexual harassment, or things like this, to say, no, we do occupy half the space in the world and have more than half the resources. So what if we acted like it? Let's just imagine that together. And then back out over the next 2 years, what needs to exist in the world to support us acting like we actually have the power that we already do? And that to me is a complete, I don't know, maybe this is sort of stating Captain Obvious, and then I was like, holy sheep dip, as I like to say if I don't want to swear, holy sheep dip. Like, let's imagine that together and then think about the 5 or 6 or 10 big things, and they might not even be that big, actually, that could happen, that could exist in the world, where we can do that. So that's a little bit of my work over the next couple of months, is to work back, because I think 2020 is a great look forward in terms of having a flag that we can see, but let's start there and move back 2.5 years rather than the other way around.
I would agree with that, Jackie. What you just shared, sort of the re-engineering approach, feels much more empowering, and it feels like there's more control. If you can sort of, have the vision for what could be, and then sort of look at incrementally how you get there, that feels more doable than sort of looking at it from a standpoint of, oh gosh, I don't know, what's possible, or I'm sitting here and these are all the things that are wrong. That feels that almost from a psychological perspective feels like it's defeating to a point where maybe one doesn't even get started. So I think it is much healthier to sort of do it the other way. And the other thing I wanted to add is, I think this, warrants a follow-up conversation once you do know what your 2020 looks like, so that we can check in with you and see what's happening next year. So we will definitely make some plans for that.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. One of the questions that I ask all of my guests is about vulnerability. I feel so strongly that vulnerability is critical to anyone who is building a thought leadership platform. You have to share part of yourself. And that's sort of the place where people are most afraid, because you're sharing some new ideas or new approaches and you're not sure how people are going to respond. Where do you feel most vulnerable in your work, and how do you manage that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I Brene Brown and all her work around this, and she's like on my list next year to actually meet in person. I feel like she's really opened up that conversation as one of the thought leaders and experts in sort of that space. I think my vulnerability sort of is this idea, and where I want to challenge myself is sort of playing it safe is one of them. Like I think I am a big thinker and a big doer, but I also feel that I'm not fully even close to activating sort of my power, if I can use that word, as, power to, not power over, because I do have risk of failure, and I do, like everyone else, like I just am scared. I don't want to fail. I want to succeed. So, shorter, easier goals seem, kind of a path. So I can't say, in Women Moving Millions, it was sort of the first thing in a long time for me where, I led with my reputation and my all, and I have given it my all. And like, oh my gosh, it worked. Isn't that awesome? So I think that's one, and sort of that vulnerability and setting big enough goals and saying them out loud and asking people to help and support you is one. I also think it's a place of great vulnerability to try to be more, speaking truth and being willing to accept it. I think a lot about privilege, in that quote that even I shared with you earlier, and Michael Kimmel, another amazing thought leader who's in the male movement around men and masculinity, says privilege is invisible to those who have it. So it's easy to say, okay, well, I want to unpack my own privilege and I want people to speak truth for me, but am I really willing to hear what they have to say? Because when you do have a lot of power, and I do, it's easy for people just to be nice to you all the time or tell you what you want to hear. And you could say, I want to hear your truth and I want you to help me be my best self. But you really got to be open to receiving that and being vulnerable, and you're going to hear things, as I have, that aren't always, the nice things that make you feel good about yourself. So I have never been disappointed in my vulnerability. I've been scared, but when you open up and you go there, and it's always rewarded, even if there's a little pain in the process, that's, this work around, and Krista Tippett says this so brilliantly, we have to balance inner work with outer work. And are we putting as much intention and energy, in both spaces? Because it's only in those two together that not only will you achieve as an individual self-actualization, but you might even, reach outer work change in a way that you never could have imagined if you weren't doing that inner work at the same time. So I think that vulnerability is key to that equation, right? If you're going to commit to both, you have to be vulnerable, or, it's not going to go anywhere.
That's a great response. So I feel like I, have a gazillion questions, but I...
Thank you. And I have you. My gosh, your work in the world. I hope someone's going to interview you for this.
Perfect.
Because, I had the blessing of interviewing Krista Tippett, who, just at dinner, who's interviewed like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And actually we had her at our WM Summit. And I'm like, it's so fun to interview the interviewer because they have this world of experience now, and you've got all these amazing thought leaders in your head and how that's even informing your work and how you're thinking about the world. So I hope you think about doing that, and I'd be happy to be the one interviewing you someday if that's of interest.
I love that. Yes, we could definitely talk about that. So my final question, I want to ask, what are you most hopeful about when you think about the future of women and girls, when you think about the future of our country and our world? What are you most hopeful about?
Well, I too want to curl up in a ball sometimes and just cry and not do anything because it really is daunting. But, I hold to this quote, and it's funny, this question about hope, because we pick a theme for the WMM Summit every year, and this past year was the power of community, and we've been playing with two that have showed up for us. One is hope, and one is courage. And I kind of dance back and forth in wondering which one is most important or which one could play out as a better theme for a curation. But I think we're landing on courage, but that's because from courage comes hope. So we kind of think the narratives stack on top of each other in a way that are beautiful. But I think for me, hope comes with just realizing when you are in conversation with people and you put big ideas sort of out there, or you try to sort of reach into what makes people tick, and, that we all want goodness to win at the end of the day. And I really, not all, of course, but, I think people do. And I think especially with women, as this has been my life's work for so long now, I think about this quote: if ever the women of the world come together purely for the good of humanity, it'll be the force of which the world has never seen, or something like that. So when I am in communities of women, and I speak a lot, and obviously our own WMM community, I know how much power for positive change is there and untapped. I would be so depressed if I think that as women and good men and good people, we have fully tapped everything we can do to make the world a better place, and we're still where we are. But I don't think that's the case. I think, if we were all a collective battery, all our energy was, a battery around what could be used to activate positive change, I think we're at 10%. And I think of that movie, like, I obsessively think about movies that, form a narrative that I hang on to, obviously one's like The Matrix or one, but there's this Wonder Woman, again, we could talk about that for about an hour and a half, but, is Limitless, this recent movie where, Scarlett Johansson like taps into her brain because of this. Or no, that was the other one. She was Lucy. But anyway, it's been the big narrative now. And I think that what gives me hope is that we have so much capacity to do good that we're not activating because A, we're not in community, B, we don't know how, and maybe those two go together. So I will continue to pour my energy into the possibility of good intention combined with community, combined with tools blending together that really will help to make the world a much greater place and leave it behind, to the next generation in the best way I possibly can.
So I have to tell you that while you're curled up in the fetal position, I too find myself feeling like I want to be in that position as well. But something about the conversation we just had, intuitively, I know that we're going to be okay. There's something about your positivity and your unapologetic sort of energy around, we've got work to do and, I'm fired up to do it. I just feel like there are so many wonderful things that will happen. And so I thank you for your leadership in, the women's movement and really trying to get women to think about how they can leverage their resources to create change for others. I think there's so much power in that. When we talk about community, one of the things we didn't touch on is how there's a level of community to that. Like, we may be different, we may have different backgrounds, we may have different resources, but I am in community with you, that I want you to have the same opportunities that I have, that I want you to have the opportunity, you know, to sort of aspire to be what you want to be and what you think is possible. And so I think that that's there's so much inspiration and hope in that. And I thank you for sharing all of that today.
Oh, my pleasure. And I love your hashtag She Roars. One of my other favorite quotes comes from Katy Perry's song Roar, which I play with my daughter endlessly. You know, if you stand for nothing, you fall for anything. So I think it's time for us, and I think, again, that's the force that is behind change, is to ask ourselves, what do we stand for? And not just what we stand for, but what are we willing to move for and change habits and change behaviors. And you know, She Roars is a great hashtag for what we're talking about today.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So She Roars, our goal is to get 2020 women from the nonprofit sector to take a thought leadership role by the year 2020. We've got lots of work to do, but I remain hopeful. We're having great conversations with women. We're seeing women sort of dipping their toe into the thought leadership pool and starting to share their insights. And one of the things I've been most amazed by is just how much knowledge there is and how much intellectual capital we have in our reserves that we are sort of slowly starting to draw out. So I'm very hopeful about sort of what we'll see in 2020 from the nonprofit sector. Jackie, this was fantastic. I thank you, and we will definitely chat again.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for your amazing work.
I feel so inspired by this interview with Jackie today. There was something, as I mentioned when I was speaking with her, very uplifting about her spirit and the context of, you know, sort of how she talked about what's possible. Jackie's comment about being in community is so important. Oftentimes, I feel we're thinking that we have to do things alone rather than taking advantage of the people and resources around us. When we think about thought leadership, people often feel that it's a lonely journey, stepping out among the masses to lead. And that's true. It is lonely and it's scary. But what if we reframe that to be that we have a community of people that are there to support us? Or even better, what if we proactively considered building our community to make sure that we have access to what kind of emotional or physical support we needed to lift us up, to help us along with the journey? I think that that's such a healthy approach to sharing some of yourself, knowing that you have access to what can help you to sort of stay the course. During this season, we've talked a lot about vulnerability with my guests, sharing their personal experiences. And that's my favorite question to ask. I'm always so curious about that. And Jackie was equally as generous when she shared about her vulnerability and the point that she made about vulnerability never disappointing and that you're always rewarded. I've never heard that before, and I think that's a great way to think about it. Like, what are the ways that we can learn from vulnerability and how it can help to strengthen our work or our mission or our fight? What if we are able to sort of see the lessons that we can get from that and sort of approach it from, what can I learn from this experience? How can I grow? You know, how can I ascend to my next level? Then it's all worth it. So I want to thank you all for tuning in for this week's episode of the Social Change Diaries. Our final episode of the season next week is with the amazing Melissa Harris Perry. I hope you'll tune in for that season finale, and I promise you it'll be worth it. See you then.